Taking some time.
How long you had your computer?
Yeah. Okay, and we are live on YouTube, and now let me let folks in. All right, good evening, everybody. This is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started. I'll take a few minutes. Welcome. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Takes a few minutes when we just get started. Welcome, everybody. If you're just joining us, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We just opened the doors.
You want to open up the chat while we're waiting?
Good idea. Okay. Give it one more minute or a magic number of my choosing. And there's the magic number. All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. This is our Renter Town Hall. We host every 2 weeks or so. As you all know, there are a lot of issues impacting the renter community these days, and code enforcement is one of them. A couple of house cleaning things. If you have any questions or concerns, please put them in the chat. We will keep monitoring the chat and bring up questions and concerns as we go. Hopefully not interrupting our guest speaker too much, but we will certainly do our best to get to every question or concern or suggestion that gets raised in the chat. Please don't use the QA because we often forget to look there. So look in the chat, that's where we'll be. Tonight, let me quickly introduce our panel. As always, my staff, David Mullins, our outreach director, Jackie Machinia, our senior outreach coordinator, Emily Towie, our outreach coordinator, Tim Huang, our outreach coordinator, and Hua Ho. She is the Maryland Service Year intern with us this year. And behind me, you can't see, is Pat Beckham, also on our staff, whose computer is not working, but she's here in spirit and in voice, trust me. So it is our pleasure to bring with us tonight a key member of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs staff. He is the chief of the Development Division, which oversees the Code Enforcement Division of the department. And historically, I'll just throw in a couple of things before Nathan begins. This is Nathan Bovell. First, it was a long time ago when the Renters Alliance first got going, way back in 2007, when we formed the Tenants Work Group and then submitted our report in 2010. One of the recommendations was the formation of an independent nonprofit dedicated to renter outreach, education, organizing, and advocacy. That was the Renters Alliance. And then soon thereafter to pursue some of those recommendations in the Tenants Work Group report. One of the recommendations was to organize code enforcement around property inspections because in the past they had not been as consistent or as focused as many in the renter community, and for that matter, the county executive's office and the council wanted to see. So over time, in 2015, believe me, it took 5 years, we pursued a piece of legislation called Bill 1915, the Renter Protection Act, which had a few very modest, though they were considered revolutionary at the time, legislative proposals. And one of them was to concentrate code enforcement on chronic violators of code, and to do so in a way that was an annual program to put emphasis on that. So with us tonight is Nathan Bovell, as I say, the Chief of Community Development, which is the department that oversees the Code Enforcement Department. We had expected the manager of Code Enforcement, Tamala Harris, to be here tonight, but she had a family emergency, and so Nathan will take it on himself. So with that, let me turn to Nathan Bovell and welcome you and thank you for being with us tonight.
Matt, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I will like to say that, anytime we have the opportunity to be invited by the Renters Alliance and to engage with the community, we'll take it. I think it's a very, very important work that you do, protecting the rights of renters in Montgomery County. It's needed, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with you in that effort. Having that said, again, my name is Nathan Bovell. I am the Chief of Community Development for DHCA. I've been with the department for just 3 years. As of last week, I oversee the Code Enforcement Program, the Office of Common Ownership Communities, and our Office of Neighborhood Revitalization. But today we're focusing on code. And as Matt said, we were expected to be joined, or I was expected to have with me, Tamala Robinson, who is really our resident expert on anything code enforcement. She's been with the department for numerous years. She started as a code inspector, moved up to a code enforcement supervisor, and now she is manager of the code enforcement program. But she had an unfortunate emergency, so please bear with me. I put together a quick PowerPoint presentation today. Initially, she can do these things off of the top of her head because she's been doing it for so many years. But I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you that's going to go over kind of the history of the Troubled Properties program. And this presentation really is going to focus on the Troubled Properties program. We could spend hours talking about code enforcement in general. But at Matt's request, this presentation specifically will center around code enforcement related to the Troubled Properties program, which is the inspection of multifamily buildings in Montgomery County. So let me see if I can get my technology together, share my screen, and I will start the PowerPoint presentation. Can we see the entire screen?
Yes.
Okay. Like Matt said, prior to Bill 1915, there was little structure to Montgomery County and the Department of Housing and Community Affairs code enforcement conducting multifamily inspections. Most of those inspections were complaint-based inspections, which is kind of what we do now for our single-family properties. But Bill 1915 was enacted in November of 2016, and it came out of a huge group of advocates, and pretty much headed by the Renters Alliance, also the county council and the county exec, that saw a need for a more stringent enforcement of property maintenance in multifamily properties. And for multifamily properties here in Montgomery County, that's 2 or more buildings. Some jurisdictions, it's 4 or more or 5 or more. But in Montgomery County, it's if you have 2 or more units in a building, that's considered to be a multifamily property. Bill 1915 required DHCA to inspect each complex in Montgomery County. And when we say their personal living quarters and the complex, that means we're inspecting the grounds, the common areas, and the units of those properties. And we were charged with inspecting them within a 3-year period or more often. We'll get to that more often a bit later. At the time that Bill 1915 was passed, there were about 77,000 units to be inspected and over 600 properties in Montgomery County. And what the bill stated was that we were going to have a 2-year period where the county would have what they called a surge of inspections, and we would inspect a sample of units in all of the multifamily properties in Montgomery County that had an occupancy permit issued before January 2015. So it was really any property that was built before January 2015. That legislation initially came out. It didn't have regulations attached to it, but essentially it said that we had to inspect those properties. And then if we found certain criterion in those properties, we would have to inspect them more frequently than 3 years. And every year, if we found certain situations, and those were things that adversely affected the immediate health and safety of tenants, had 20% of infestation, excessive mold growth, lack of egress, pervasive water leaks, or lack of utilities. 1915 also required that we inspect all of those properties and have the inspections completed by July 1st of 2019. Okay. We were required to produce the first report in September of 2018. That was essentially kind of our first trouble properties report, if you all are familiar with that report. But it's not, didn't have the look of the reports that we produce now because the regulations had not yet been adopted. There were no trouble property designations at that time because we didn't have the regulations. But at the time, we found that 14 properties identified as having to require those annual inspections. And those were the ones that had either the pervasive mold growth, the infestation, or severe health and safety violations that were found in those units. At the same time that all of this was going on, the department, prior to me being there, was working on developing the executive regulations, and that's 5-17, which would sort of detail how the department would inspect properties, how we would designate them as troubled and at risk, how we would classify violations. It required that we classify violations by the severity and the quantity of violations, and it stipulated that properties that were designated as troubled based on the criterion that we developed would have to submit a corrective action plan, which is a plan that they submit to the department outlining how they expect to correct violations, to institute sort of preventive maintenance measures to prevent violations from occurring in the future. As part of that effort, the department placed violations into 4 categories. There were health and safety violations, higher priority violations, medium priority violations, and lower priority violations. Health and safety violations had a higher point score, and the point score was reduced by 1 until we got to lower priority violations that were assigned 1 point. And in addition to that, we would assign the points to those violations to determine what we called a severity score, which was the average number, and I'm sorry, the severity score and a total violation score, which were the total number of violations, average number of violations per unit. Those, what we call SV and TV scores, were used to plot on a graph to determine how properties would be designated as troubled or at risk or compliant. I'm sort of oversimplifying this because there was actually a very convoluted process that I'll sort of talk about in terms of what that initial regulation stipulated. This is a sample, just a sample of what that graph might look like. So with the initial 5-17 regulation, the department was charged with inspecting all of the properties within that fiscal year. Then after all of the properties were inspected, at the end of that fiscal year, they would calculate the mean LTV score and the mean SV score for all of those properties. They would plot those properties on a graph, and those properties that would fit in this upper right left-hand quadrant would be considered at risk. The lower right-hand quadrant was also at risk. The upper right-hand quadrant was troubled, and the lower left-hand quadrant was considered to be compliant. It was a very sort of convoluted process because properties could be inspected very early in the fiscal year, but they wouldn't get the results of their designations until the end of this fiscal year, and even beyond that, because the report was due September 1st. So our fiscal years start July 1st and end June 30th. So you could be inspected in July 1st, but you might not get your results until the following September. So the law required that we produce that report on the first of each year. The first report was developed in 2019. We inspected 12,946 units at 283 properties, and 188 at the time were considered compliant, 50 were at risk, and 45 were troubled. That was really sort of our first sort of attempt at implementing the troubled properties law. Unfortunately, right after that, as you all will recall, we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. Our inspections were essentially halted. We pretty much did exterior inspections. We did emergency inspections that weren't part of what we call mandated inspections, where we would go out and inspect the properties to determine if they were troubled or at risk. So there were no real inspections that took place between 2020 and 2022. Matt, do you want me to take a break for questions now or keep going?
No, just to emphasize what you just said, Nathan, that the COVID pandemic really did throw off the rails a number of programs, including code enforcement. Although, again, Nathan, I believe that code enforcement was available for Zoom inspections and emergency inspections. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. Are there any questions for Nathan as he's going along?
There is a question in the chat about whether there's ever been an inspection over at Falkland Chase. I don't know if you have that data in front of you, but that is one of the questions.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we hold specific questions about buildings and properties until the end? If there's a programmatic question about what's been presented so far, then we can do that. Otherwise, let's wait till the end.
Okay. The other thing that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic that was interesting was that there was a lot more wear and tear on units. Many people were home, children were home all during the day because of the distance learning at schools. Lots of folks began teleworking during that period. Maintenance folks were trepidatious about going into units for fear of catching COVID-19. So there were a lot of dynamics that happened in those 2 years where there was more wear and tear on properties, and essentially, arguably less maintenance that happened during that time. Luckily, the pandemic passed or lessened, however you want to look at it, and the department began inspecting properties again in 2022. And during the 2022 report, there were 851 units inspected at 178 properties. So we were sort of gearing ourselves back up to doing inspections again. And there were 98 compliant, 39 at risk, and 41 troubled properties. In September of 2023, we really ramped ourselves back up to a full force. We tried to catch up on any inspections that were missed in the prior year. So we not quite, but almost doubled the amount of inspections that we did. So we had 1,627 inspections in 309 properties. And of course, with that kind of volume, there were an increase in the number of properties that were compliant, but there were also an increase in the numbers of properties that were considered troubled, where we had 77 properties that were troubled in that year. Similarly, in September of 2024, we were sort of back down to our routine number of inspections where we did about 12,000 inspections at 209 properties. And of those, we saw a little bit of a drop in the number of troubled properties that went down from 77 to 54. But what those numbers don't show you is that we still had a number of properties from the prior year that were considered troubled for failure to comply with certain parts of their regulation, like submitting their corrective action plans. And the department also requires that they submit tenant maintenance logs for 2 quarters so that we can review their response time to those logs. If they didn't do those things, even though their inspection result might have yielded a at risk or a compliant rating, they remain troubled for failure to submit those logs. And I believe there were about 30 properties that failed to do that, so they were still considered troubled at the time. And we're going to talk about this later, but somewhere between 2024 and 2025, there was some other legislation that helped to encourage properties to gain compliance and to better maintain their properties. One of them was the rent stabilization law, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we did see a drop in the number of troubled properties, even though we saw the consistent number of inspected properties in 2025, which is our most recent report. So we did, again, just about 15,400 units at 350 properties. 248 were compliant, 27 were at risk, and 29 were troubled, which was the lowest number of troubled properties that we've seen since the regulation began.
Nathan, I do have a question now, because we work in properties across Montgomery County, and I'm sure you know that there are properties of 6 units and 12 units, and then there are properties with 1,100 units, like the Enclave. Do you all, are you able to disaggregate, when you say you've done X amount of properties, how many of them were small properties versus large properties? Obviously, an at-risk property like the Enclave at 1,100 units is a much bigger problem than, say, a 6-unit building that is moderately at risk or at risk.
Matt, that's an excellent question. We don't produce that data in the report, but we do look at it. And what we find in Montgomery County is that the preponderance of the properties that are troubled are the smaller properties. That's one of the reasons why we always sort of put the reports in the number of units and also in the number of properties. Because if you say we have 77 troubled properties, that sounds like a really large number. But if you look at the number of units that are troubled, it's significantly smaller. And what we find is that usually the properties that are, 20 units or less, there's a significantly higher number of troubled properties in that number. And for those that are 5 or less are where we find most of the troubled properties. There are only usually a handful of the large properties that we find in that troubled status. And that's for a number of reasons. One is the larger properties have more financial resources to make repairs. A lot of the smaller mom and pop landlords have a harder time keeping the properties maintained. But the bigger issue is that the way the regulation is written, if you have 20% or more of your properties have infestation, or 20% of more of your properties have mold, you're automatically going to be considered trouble. So if you have a 5-unit building or a 2-unit building and you find one tenant in there where we see roach infestation or rodent infestation or mold, that property is automatically going to be troubled. So it kind of skews the numbers when you look at just the total number of properties, but that's why we also include the total number of units in the troubled properties report. And we're going to take a look at the most recent troubled property report as we go through the presentation.
And another question, Nathan, would be the scoring. Say you've got an apartment building of 100 units and you find 2 or 3 that have mold or vermin or some other violation, but you find that the common areas are in violation. So the community room, the laundry rooms, the foyer, what have you, does that receive a higher score of demerit as so many, as more people would have access to of an area of the building of the community that is in violation versus a private apartment?
Well, it's not necessarily a higher score, but it depends on how pervasive and how prevalent that problem is. But it is factored into the calculation. So if we see even a small amount of mold in a common area, that's going to count, and it gets kind of factored into the total unit score when we do the analysis.
Right, because like we've seen buildings where the front doors remain unlocked, or where the stairwells, the fire stairwells have garbage or homeless people or something like that, or where there are broken windows on the community space or trash around the property. But inside the apartments, long-term tenants have spotless, wonderful homes.
Right.
So I
Well,
wonder,
like broken windows anywhere that someone could be cut, that's a health and safety violation, and it's considered a higher priority violation. So it's going to have a higher weight as we calculate the scores. And with those higher severity violations, there's also a more prompt response time that we expect those violations to be corrected. So if you've got a broken closet pole, that's a low priority violation. We might give someone 30 days to get that fixed. However, if we see a exposed wires on an electrical outlet or a broken globe with glass exposed on a globe for a light, that's going to be a high priority violation, and they're going to have to fix those usually within 24 to 48 hours. And we come back within 24 to 48 hours to look at all of those high priority violations, and then we give them what the timeframes are for the lower priority violations or lesser priority violations when we give them their inspection report. Does that answer your question?
yeah, again, I'm just trying to distinguish if community spaces have a higher weight of score, since more people have access and depend on community spaces than an individual unit. And so if a light bulb is, or if there's this health and safety violation in a unit, it's going to impact the people in the unit. But if there's a health and safety violation in the common area, it's going to impact the entire community. And so I'm wondering if it gets a higher score, if we distinguish scoring that way.
Yeah, I'll have to double check with Tamala. I know that certain violations in common areas do have a higher severity than they might have in a unit. So in that respect, yes, the score is higher, but it's still factored ultimately by a violation per unit or severity, their severity score. So the severity is regardless of whether it's in a unit or not, but the total violation score considers the number of units that we inspected compared to all of the violations that we found. The other thing we can sort of just talk about, and it's not in the slide, is just what does the inspection process look like? So we give a property owner notification of when their inspection is going to take place, and we bring enough inspectors to take care of the number of inspections that we expect to get that day. So if we have a large property, say one that's 1,100 units, I won't say what the name of that property is, but it's the largest property in Montgomery County, we will go with 15 inspectors. And those 15 inspectors will typically take 3 to 4 days to gain access and inspect every unit in that property if they're in the trouble status. And when that happens, the property owner is also required to send a representative to accompany the inspectors to that unit. So they have to get 15 either porters or maintenance guys or property management staff to escort them into those units. And like I said, those inspections may take up to 4 days to inspect a property of that size. After the property inspection has taken place, all of the inspectors will download their individual inspections into a database that the department maintains. And that database is what determines the severity of the violation. The inspectors don't determine that. They just note exactly what the violation is. They know where the violation is. They're able to take pictures of the violations, and that gets uploaded into a database that produces a inspection report that lists all of the violations according to severity and the number and the location and the photographs. That report is provided to the property manager that tells them how long they have to correct any of the violations that were found when we're coming back. And Tamala staff will go back as many times as they need to. It's called a reinspection, to keep looking at those inspections until all of those violations have been corrected. And unfortunately, we have some properties that don't correct all the violations in a year. They carry over into the next year, which is why some of them still remain troubled, even if they have fewer violations found the following year. When a property is troubled, we're required to inspect every single unit in that property the following year. If a property is considered to be at risk, then we inspect somewhere between 25 to 50% of those properties every 2 years. And if a property is considered to be compliant, then we inspect that property at 25% every 3 years. The slide that we have up now shows sort of the effects of the rent stabilization law. Or I hope I can't see you all now because I've got my slide deck up, but I hope some of you may be familiar with the rent stabilization law. That's a law that went into effect in July of 2024. And in part, what it did is it prohibited troubled or at-risk properties from increasing their rents at regulated properties. Not every property is a regulated property, but most properties that have low to moderate income or affordable components to them are regulated. This was really important because prior to the rent stabilization law, there were no real serious consequences for being on a troubled property list. The department would produce a list. It would show up in some obscure places in county websites. But other than them having to get inspected every year, there was no real sort of disincentive to get off of that troubled property list. And we started to sort of recognize that. And that's one of the reasons why the troubled and at-risk properties were attached to the rent stabilization bill that prohibited them from raising rents. That sent shimmies up and down the spine of landlords. And we saw a very serious push for them to start to maintain their properties in a more efficient manner and correct violations after the violations were given to them. Since the passing of the law, so in this most recent FY25, there was a 69% decrease in the number of units designated as troubled. And that was the number of units went from 7,269 to 2,264 units in 2025. And there was similarly a large reduction, 57%, in the number of properties that were designated as at risk. And the rate of housing citations issued dropped by more than half. A citation is different than a violation. A citation is issued when we give a notice of violation to a landlord or a property owner, and they fail to correct the violation. Usually, we will give them a second notice of violation, maybe extending the time. And if they don't respond to that, then we give them a citation. And when we give them a citation, there are fines attached to that. They have to go to court. But the challenge with that is that the court system since COVID have been so backed up that it takes at least 6 months for us to get a case into court after we issue a citation. And oh, by the way, once that citation is heard in court, typically the judge will decrease the amount of fines that we're seeking to collect in this citation or dismiss them altogether if the landlord has corrected the violation at that time. I'll break now for questions.
I just want to emphasize something that's at the top line here. And people should know that if your property is covered under the rent stabilization law, which by the way means that it has to have been built more than 23 years ago and be in Montgomery County. If it's in Gaithersburg, you're not covered. If it's in Rockville, you're not covered. Tacoma Park has its own rent stabilization law, so it's covered separately. But so these are properties that are in Montgomery County, not in those three municipalities. And your property is more than 23 years old. If it is covered by the rent stabilization law and it is a troubled property, they are not permitted to raise rents. And so we like it when enforcement has to do with hitting them in the pocketbook, because there's nothing more dear to the landlord than keeping rent coming in. So yes, other questions for Mr. Bovell?
Can they enter those properties?
We've got a couple mold related questions. They're not a specific property, but do you want to also hold off on those because it's a specific kind of condition thing, or do you want me to?
Let's do the specific condition
Yeah.
ones after I finish.
Great.
Okay. So when the rent stabilization law went into effect, property owners, they really increased their efforts. Some of them have hired consultants. They've hired additional maintenance staff. We find that when we're conducting inspections, many of them will have maintenance staff or contractors walking with the inspectors during the inspection so that they can fix the items as they're being identified. They still count. We still score them. But it significantly lessens the amount of times that we have to come back to verify that the violations have been corrected. We have also contractors and sort of property management advocates who are working with property management staff to issue and develop their corrective action plans and to gather their tenant work requests, because they're anxious to get their violations corrected and to comply with the regulations. And that helps us to actually get those violations corrected much sooner, which is of a huge value to the residents who have to live in those units with violations. That brings us to another issue. The department is in the process of changing the troubled property regulations. That's 5-17. The passing of the rent stabilization laws is requiring us to change them for several reasons. If you will recall, we initially wouldn't give properties their designations until September 1st of the year after their fiscal year after their properties were inspected, which means that properties could stay on that property, troubled property or at-risk property list for an extended period of time. Also, because we typically only inspect at-risk properties every 2 years, the the rent stabilization regulations had the potential to penalize at-risk properties more severely than troubled properties, because troubled properties were inspected every year and at-risk properties were inspected every 2 years. So the new regulation states that properties have an opportunity to make a requested inspection. There's certain criteria that has to happen in order for that to take place. For the at-risk properties, they have to have corrected all the violations before they can come back and say, I'd like to request another inspection. And we're going to come back and we're going to inspect another 20 to 25 to 50% of the properties. And if they get a compliant designation, then they no longer have to comply with the rent stabilization law. But we're still going to come back and inspect them every 2 years. For the troubled properties, if they have to correct all of the violations, they have to submit their corrective action plan, and they still are required to submit 2 quarters of tenant work request logs before we would consider inspecting them again. So if you're troubled, and these are proposed, so this is not adopted yet, but if they're troubled, then they would have to remain troubled for at least 6 months before they could ask for a reinspection, and then they would have to yield a compliant result in order to no longer have to comply with the rent stabilization rent restriction. But we would still come back and inspect them the next year. And we do that because we want to make sure that people aren't doing Band-Aid fixes, trying to cover over items, painting over mold. So we were going to still come back to the troubled properties every year to inspect 100% of those units. The other thing that the law does is it 1 second. Amends the time frame of when we notify them of inspections. So, like I said, instead of waiting till September 1st of the following fiscal year, the new regulation says that we will notify them of their inspection results within 30 days of their inspection being completed. Saying that sounds really easy, but on the back end, there was a lot of programming, a lot of adjustments that were made to the code enforcement application in order to facilitate that. And the moving forward, if the regulations are adopted, we're using a fixed TV and SV score rather than an average or a mean TV and SV score, so that properties will know exactly what the standard is. And oh, by the way, if you use a mean or an average TV and SV score, no matter what condition the properties are in, they could be in pristine condition, but if you're using averages, you're still going to have properties that are designated as troubled and at risk, even though they're being maintained in acceptable condition. So we believe that the fixed TV and SV score, the immediate notification of the property designations, and the ability for them to ask for re-inspections will significantly help tenants, because properties want to become compliant. And they can only do that through inspections that yield compliant results. So we're looking forward to those. So moving forward, if these regulations went out for publication back in February for public comment, the public comment period ended in March of this year. And now they're going through a process of being reviewed by the county attorneys. And then they will be sent off to the county exec's office and to the council for their review and for their adoption. Once they're adopted, there's going to be an intensive training of staff on how to handle the new regulations, and a lot of outreach and training to landlords, property owners, and management companies to make them aware of what the new regulations are as well.
Nathan, let me just jump in quick on it to clarify something you said before. When a property is at risk, or are at-risk properties prohibited from raising rents if they're covered by rent stabilization?
If they're regulated properties, at-risk properties cannot raise rents. That's correct.
Okay, so at-risk and troubled cannot raise rents. But if they do become compliant, it's not that they're not subject to the rent stabilization law. It's just that they can raise rents within the rent stabilization law.
That's correct.
So they're still subject to rent stabilization. They just now can raise rents. Whereas if they were on the troubled or at risk list, they could not raise rents until they became compliant.
Yes, they still have to abide by every other portion of the law, and they can't arbitrarily say, I want a 50% raise increase in my rents. They have to abide by the regulations in the rent stabilization law. And what the department is doing is we are working on creating a rental housing portal that will allow anyone to go in, look at a property. You can see what the designation is, when the designation changes. We're going to have to substantially change the structure of the troubled property report, because we may have to report on the initial inspections on what we found, but we also will have to report on any follow-up inspections to show what the results of any of those inspections were, if they had re-inspections after being designated as troubled and at risk. I have some resources here, and we can, I'll click through some of these. I won't click through the DHCA web page, but if you wanted to, well, I'll click through here. So it's a very useful website. You can go onto the website and you see there's a banner across the top. The very first thing that you see is the troubled and at-risk property report. You can click through and get information on rent stabilization. You can get information on our Common Area Assistance Fund, which is a fund that helps common ownership communities take care of life, health, and safety items that they can't afford to fix under certain circumstances. And then we have our voluntarily rent guidelines, We have our rental marketplace where you can look at affordable units, and our nonprofit preservation fund. On the slide deck that I was showing you, the second item was actually the troubled and at-risk property report. So if we click the view report, we will always have, and this is something that's also new because up until last year, the troubled property report was not displayed on our website. You had to go through County Stat, which is a sort of a convoluted, not convoluted, but it's a cumbersome website to manage in order to find out the status of property. So after meeting with council last year, we committed to putting the report on our website, and we have a list of all the properties that were designated as troubled, all those that are designated as at risk, and we also have a copy of the complete report. This spreadsheet, chart here shows you when we talk about having a certain number of properties designated as troubled, you can see that by the unit size, the preponderance of the properties in the county are compliant. And the troubled properties that we had for 25 were just those 29 properties, but I think I said 30, there were actually 38 that were carried over from the year before for failing to submit those corrective action plans. But in general, you can see that the inventory in Montgomery County is fairly good. If you wanted to just say, let me just take a look at where properties stand, you can look at the properties identified as troubled, and there's a chart here that will show you the properties, and these are the properties that were inspected that year, what was troubled and what was at risk. So these are all troubled in FY25, but it shows whether they were troubled or at risk in FY24 as well.
Is there a way to sort any of these based on the size of the property? Again,
you could download that, I believe, into an Excel spreadsheet, but if you look at column here, it does have a unit count. So when you look at the number of properties that are troubled, you see most of them are smaller properties. We come down near the bottom, we get to one that's about 102 units, but most of them you see are 3 or 4 unit buildings.
Right.
And we can do the same thing for the properties that were identified as at risk. It's sort of the same chart. It shows their severity rating is at risk.
And there's some of our famous properties.
Yeah. Now you see for the at-risk properties, we're starting to see a lot more of the larger unit counts. And what we do for especially some of those larger properties, if they were troubled one year and at risk the next year, we have often said, although you're at risk, we are still going to inspect your property at 100%. We have the option to do that. We don't do that for compliant properties, but we absolutely do that for troubled properties. The other resource I wanted to share was our eProperty website. And that's where you can go in and you can look at a property, or you can look at an address. And this is not just for multifamily. This is any property, any address where you can go into a community and you can look at the number of violations. So Matt, give me the name of a property.
Let's try, say, the Enclave.
Somehow I knew you were going to say that. You can look at that community. You would come down and you would hit code enforcement cases, and you can see a list. And this is public information. You can see a list of all of the violations that are issued for those. It'll tell you the status of the violations, if it was corrected or not. And I believe Yeah, so this tells you, this column where my cursor is now tells you that it's a complaint. I believe that it might also show you if it was a mandated inspection, which was one of the like a troubled property inspection. I'd have to scroll through because this property has so many violations, but I'd have to scroll through. It would tell you if there was a mandated inspection. It will tell you whether it was listed as compliant or troubled or at risk as well.
And some of those, it would say administrative.
It says
Um,
administrative. That's what it
Right,
says.
and
Or
then if you click on it, you'll
100%.
get a whole sub-report within that.
Right.
But yeah, we saw the other day, we saw one that had 100% inspection, 33% or whatever. It was listed on there. That was really helpful to tell
Do
the
you remember?
tenants.
Do you remember what property it was?
Well, Spring Park had they were on there before, so their 100% came up, we were looking, with Park with a C, because, you
That's
gotta,
right. That's right. That's right.
yeah, you
I
got,
should
you
have known
gotta,
that.
gotta set yourself out there.
See, we can't, or maybe we can. We can sort by case type. So this is an example of the administrative 25% of 400 units were inspected here. 100% of 400 units, that shows that they were troubled. You can click on that and it gives you some data to show you that it was considered troubled, and when the close date is when the inspection was completed. So that may take them more than 1 day to actually complete an inspection.
And for those using eProperties, it's a very good and useful system, but it can be temperamental. So sometimes it's Spring Park as the community name, sometimes it's Spring Park Apartments, sometimes it's just the address of the leasing office. And so if you can't find it, play around a little bit and see if something other than just the name works.
But it's definitely come a long way. I got it because it's worth mentioning. You can find out the year it was built if you're that whole rental on the housing portal, and then Ulta cases are up there now, which is a feature I didn't realize too. And
Oh yeah, I'll go
license
back
data.
and show that. So you can look at licensing data and Ulta data, and at some point it will probably have rent stabilization data as well. I also have a link here to the code enforcement handbook that has some of the laws, some of the regulations that we monitor. So the air conditioning laws, the window guards, carbon monoxide alarms, mercury service regulators, vacant properties, and the handbook just in general also talks about um, um, tells landlords what kind of things we look at when we go to inspect the property. And the last resource I have listed is the draft 125 ER Executive Regulation 125. So if you wanted to get bored and you just want to read the entire regulation that was put out for public comment, that is listed here. Just remember that this was a draft. It's not been adopted. There have been some changes that have been made to this based on the public comment, but it's not ready for us to share with the general public yet until we share it with our county attorneys, the county exec's office, and it gets approved by the council. One of the things we took out, if you go through, you won't see that convoluted chart. This is actually taken, it won't show in the next report, but what happens in the new report and the new regulation is simply if you have an elevated TV score or an elevated SV score, you're considered to be at risk. If you have an elevated TV score and an elevated SV score, you're compliant. And if neither are elevated, you're if you have an elevated TV and SV score, you're troubled. And if neither are elevated, then you're compliant. So we sort of took out plotting things on a graph and putting them into quadrants and tried to, make it a way that's easier for the common Joe to understand. So that's kind of the preponderance of what I wanted to share with you about troubled properties. And I'm open to taking any questions. Can I stop sharing the screen, Mark, so I can see?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean,
Go right
Matt,
ahead.
I'm
That's
sorry.
okay. Take any of the saints, Matthew, Luke, Mark, or whoever.
Or John.
John.
Can
By the
you
way, a
just oh,
quick question, Nathan. Does code enforce state code requirements as well?
No, so there are, and it's interesting that you ask that because there's some new state regulations that just came out regarding mold. Is that why you were asking? See, I knew where you were going with that. We're still working with our county attorneys to try to determine what requirements we have for that. As right now, what we're thinking is that if we identify mold in a property and we issue a notice of violation, if they don't um, comply with correcting that violation, then that may be referred to the state for their investigation. But we don't regulate mold right now. We can cite for it. We often will ask for mold testing if it seems pervasive. But right now, it's just a violation for us. So we're going to be working with our county attorneys and the state on how we're going to implement that new law. And there's one other interesting thing I wanted to share with you guys. I don't know if you were aware, Matt, but there was another law that was just passed. I don't remember the number right now, but it might be 625. It's 625 is the regulation, and that removes. So Ulta typically was the agency that would take a look at all landlord-tenant disputes, and the Office of Consumer Protection looked at landlord and tenant disputes specifically as an Ulta issue. So they did not consider landlords to be merchants and tenants to be consumers. But 625 removed that from the law. So now, effective about maybe a couple of months ago, landlords and tenants are subject to consumer protection laws in Montgomery County as well. So code enforcement and Ulta, the county attorneys, and Office of Consumer Protection have been having a series of meetings to work through workflows and how we can refer cases from either Ulta or code enforcement to the Office of the County Consumer Protection if there are deceptive trade practices. And what we're looking at is pervasive failure to fix maintenance items is a defective practice. Listing your property as a luxury or resort style living on your website while you have doors that don't work and elevators don't work and chillers that are having broken and flooding people's units is a deceptive trade practice. So we're able now to start referring those to the county's Office of Consumer Protection. And we're looking forward to having that be an increased enforcement arm in the tool belt that we have as well.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that increased enforcement. We've had a lot of properties that fall under that. Okay, questions for Chief Community Development Division, Nathan Bovell. What have we got, folks?
well, you got a couple follow-ups on that mold point. That someone before it, I guess while the updates are happening, I think so people had some questions about kind of what's currently you used painting over mold as an example earlier. That actually was a question, is that, okay? And then, someone's kind of been told that it isn't regulated. So I think can you let people know what the current
Painting
assessment
over mold is absolutely not okay. So what we are looking for when we identify mold is that mold almost always is due to some sort of moisture or water source that either gets into the wood, the drywall, the carpet. We're looking for them to eliminate the source of that moisture, to address that first before any other sort of replacement of drywall or remediation takes place. We're dealing with a case now where there was a flood at a property, and the first thing that the property manager started to do was to cut out drywall, replace it, and paint. So saying, hey, these units are done, they can go back in. We went immediately with moisture meters, checked the moisture levels of the wall. The carpets were actually still wet, so you couldn't fool us that easily. And our job is to make sure that the root cause of the problem is not fixed, not the evidence of the problem.
That's great. That's good to hear, because if I remember, that was kind of the thrust of the state law was getting, and so that sounds like you're all already there on that.
Yeah, all of our inspectors carry moisture meters with them. It wasn't Falkland Chase, but it was another of the usual suspects.
Unfortunately, this is not an uncommon complaint. So there
We
are
know.
lots of properties that have this issue.
Yep, and that's why, and Tamala started to arm all of her inspectors with those moisture meters so that they can go out and do those types of assessments to determine whether or not they painted over the problem just to pass an inspection.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the older ones often too. The last thing I saw was
So I'm seeing, I'm sorry, because I'm
Yeah, go
seeing a
ahead.
couple people popping up on the message with Falkland Chase and Colesville Towers. And what I would say that we should do is absolutely call 311 when something like that happens. Ask for a code inspector to come out to take a look at the property. And it's best to call them before the work starts. But if they've covered over it and you start to see it come back, please call 311 so that they'll give us a chance, because if we can only cite what we can see. And if we happen to come right after they've painted and the drywall happens to still be dry at that point, it may take a couple of days, it might take a month for that moisture to reappear, but call us anytime that happens so that we can come back and reassess.
I think it's also fair to add that we presume that tenants have reached out to their property manager and landlord first and said, hey, look, we've got a mold problem here. Can you please fix it or remediate it? One should reach out for a complaint to the county when you're not getting a responsive landlord or property manager.
And that's really important, because if we are going to start to really kind of hold landlords and owners' feet to the fire about fixing things, it's better to show we tried to call them first. They ignored us. We called, and sometimes people are calling the council people before they call the management office. Call the management office first. Even if you decide to write afterwards, call your council person or call us, but call the management office first, because when we start to request those tenant logs, especially at those troubled properties, we can see when those records came in and find out how long it took to repair.
Other questions for Mr. Bovell?
Yeah, there was a question on sorry, looking it up. So if a property is at risk or troubled, what is there like a point where the license is suspended? Yeah.
Another interesting question. Very rarely have we actually suspended or revoked a rental license. And that's because that triggers other things. So if a rental license is revoked or suspended, then theoretically people shouldn't live there, and we could have to require people to move. So our best effort is to try to gain compliance. The other tool that we have that we're going to start implementing in our mailbox is escalated inspection fees. So when we come out and we do an inspection, a mandated or troubled or at risk property inspection, and we have to keep coming back and over and over again, we're going to start charging landlords for that fees. That was in the original regulation, but the technology hadn't caught up with us yet to implement it. But our technology team is working very diligently now so that we can start to charge reinspection fees to properties where we have to go out numerous times. So all of these collective things hopefully will compel landlords to become compliant, correct the violations, and maintain their properties in an effective manner.
Okay,
I
thank
have
you.
another one that came in earlier. Someone asked, they said that my 3-year-old 360 plus unit property is due for its first terrennial inspection of 25% of the units. I have reason to believe there are patterns of problems that fall under the troubled properties definition. To be designated troubled, must we wait for 3 full years of terrennial inspections?
Well, we start that process after a property is 3 years old. You can request a complaint inspection anytime you want. But if your property is now coming up for its first triennial inspection, that's what we use, triennial or mandated inspection. When we inspect it, if we find out it's troubled, we're going to be there the very next year inspecting 100% of the units.
But
Um,
Nathan, you also, for routinely at an inspection, the code enforcement department will send notice out to the tenants that you're coming. Is that correct?
Yes, and we also will give tenants an opportunity to say, "Will you inspect my unit while you're here?"
That's what
And
that's what I'm
while
getting to.
we're inspecting, they often will say, "Do you have any violations that you want to bring to my attention in the
Right.
unit when we get there?"
So what I'm
Thanks for
saying,
the shout out to Kevin too, by the way.
right? So if you know that first of all, as Mr. Bovell says, you can make a complaint at any time, and if inspectors are out there and they see a severity of code violations, then I expect the department will step up their inspection regime overall. But if it's part of a routine annual or triennial inspection, you will be given notice that they're coming, and you are welcome at any time to contact the code enforcement department, and let them know, hey, look, I'd like you to look in this common area, or I'd like you to look in this particular apartment because certain appliances are broken, or some other issue. You're more than welcome to let them know. Now, one other thing, Nathan, is that many tenants are afraid to speak to inspectors in front of property staff. And while property staff will need to often accompany the code inspector in order to let them in an apartment or some other common space, what are the rights of tenants in terms of protecting their privacy during this process?
There are a couple. One is you can always ask for the lead inspector or for the inspector supervisor, and you can send a message to them separately, or you can call 311 and leave a message. But there are also protections in place. So, we know that sometimes, people are upset that management has to come with them when we do inspections. But that's sort of not a safety issue, but we want to make sure that they're aware of what's going on. And also, we don't like to go into units unaccompanied by anyone. We won't go into a vacant unit by ourselves. So management has to be there. But that's one of the reasons why Alta exists. If there's any kind of retaliation that takes place after an inspection or after a report of a violation, we would like to know about that. And Alta is starting to take a lot long and hard looks at tenants who use, landlords who use tenant tactics like not renewing a lease, waiting for a lease to expire and not renewing it.
We know something about that. But one thing, again, back to say the tenant is home, the inspector and the property manager or maintenance staff knock on the door and say, we'd like to come in to do the inspection. It's within the right of the tenant to say, I'll let the inspector in, but we don't want the maintenance or manager in. I think that is their right to do so. Is that correct?
I'll check on that. We typically want to have maintenance there so they can't contest or they don't have any second guess about what the violation was observed. But let me put a pin in that and then I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention though is that even like at the at risk or compliant properties, even though we're going to inspect 25 to 50% of the units, the notice of inspection goes out to 100% of the units because we don't tell the property manager or the property owner which units are going to be inspected
Sure.
until that day, and they run the random analysis to pick.
Yeah,
which
I
those
believe
are.
I believe just it's our understanding that this is your private apartment, and that you don't have to let anybody in unless there's a court order to do so. However,
There is most leases though will have a provision that says we have a right to enter given notice, and they may argue that I gave you the 48 hours notice that we were
That's right.
coming in to enter, so we can come in.
Well, they can't come in. What they can do is they say, if you don't let us in, then we'll sue you for eviction for breach of lease.
Yeah.
But they can't barge in. And the only time that they could actually barge in is if they're with the police or with fire, or there is
Or
an
there's a bona fide
actual
emergency.
emergency.
That's correct.
Is that, yeah. So I'm telling people to be cautious, but if you really have concerns about having property staff and the inspector in your apartment at the same time, I believe that you have the right to say, I only want the inspector and not the property manager. But the best approach would be to tell the code enforcement folks in advance what your issues are, so you don't have to share that in front of a property staff member.
Nathan, we have another question about reasonable amount of time to fix an unlocked front door to the apartment building. It's been looks like over a week now. What would you say is reasonable in that situation?
So an unlocked entry door to the apartment building is different than an unlocked door to a unit.
Yeah, I believe it's
And
to the building
yeah,
itself,
yeah,
not the individual.
and there, trust me, I'm aware of a number of properties that have had issues with unlocked entry doors for various reasons. Some of them, the landlords have actively been trying to repair, and they're folks who are purposefully damaging the unit so they can let people in and out of the building without having to buzz them in. Some of them, they're issues that have very old and outdated door mechanisms that takes a significantly long time for them to get repair parts. I have personally been involved in several units in downtown Silver Spring and the White Oak area, dealing with those unlocked door issues. Typically, if it's a violation, they might get 30 days to repair it. If they show that they're making active steps to repair that, and what we usually do is ask for contracts. Let us see the contracts with this service provider that's doing the work. I've personally looked at some of those at a building in downtown Silver Spring off Georgia Avenue. That's a senior building that I'm not going to say the name of, but they were actively trying to repair the door, and they ended up having to replace a large components of that actual door mechanism. The same thing with the one on Lockwood and the Enclave. They've had serious problems with people just breaking the doors. They fix them. We see that they're fixed. We've been there to look to see that they're fixed. And then the next day, someone's jammed them because unfortunately, there's some undesirable people who either associate with people in the unit, in the building, or live in the unit, or just who are vagrants who happen to go into those units that are breaking them. But we try to make sure that we do issue the notices of violation. We have issued some citations for unlocked entry doors. And we typically will try to, like I said, keep going back to check, to look at the contracts that they're getting and to make sure that they're fixed. Unfortunately, it's a very common problem. It's not just in Montgomery County.
Unfortunately, it seems to be the same properties that have the same door problems all the time, while other properties have very secure doors because they invested in them and they have very secure doors. We've been going in and out of the Enclave for years, and I've never seen the door locked in any of those buildings every time we've been up there. And I know the other building you're talking about, they'd probably be better off simply installing a revolving door. Anyway, a question did come up a couple of times about crime, and I imagine you can take it off the table, Nathan, but the amount of crime in a building or a community is not a code enforcement issue. Is that correct?
That is not a code enforcement issue. Unfortunately, that's a police issue, but it's also an issue that could rise to the level of a consumer protection issue if there's certain things that the property management office is not doing, like making attempts to keep the doors locked, or there have been some where it's advertised that the building is secure, that there's a concierge service, and then there aren't any. So those things could rise to the level of consumer protection issues. They would probably go through the ULTA pipeline to get there, not through code enforcement.
All right, we have just a few more minutes. Is there a last question for Nathan Bovell? Then yeah. Quick.
Sorry, I don't know if did we answer the one about a tenant who lives in a mixed use development in which the other there's code violations from the like the commercial space that affects the residential space. Is there a mechanism to deal with that?
Call 311.
Okay.
And if it's not under the purview of code enforcement, and I would ask for code enforcement first, then we would make a referral to the appropriate department if it's not us.
All right, with
Oh.
that, I want to thank the Chief of Community Development, Nathan Bovell, for spending so much time with us. We want to extend well wishes to Tamala Robinson. Hope that her issue is resolved and she's well. And we'll say just a few more things as a reminder. Let's go through them. Emily, go ahead.
Sure. So we just heard about code enforcement. The other side of that is the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs. So they handle not maintenance issues and condition issues, but lease and ledger security deposit issues, things of that nature. So similar to code, first you should try to resolve it with your property manager or your landlord. If they are able to to address fix your ledger in a reasonable amount of time or unwilling, unable, whatever it may be, you can then escalate it by calling 311 and asking for Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, or you can also file a complaint online and we'll put the link in the chat there. And if you're not sure if your issue is complaint worthy, feel free to reach out to the Renters Alliance and we can guide you through that.
I'd also say if you're not sure whether it's complaint worthy, file the complaint anyway, and give us a chance to make that decision, whether it's for code, rent stabilization, or Ulta. Nothing's going to happen if you make a complaint and it doesn't rise. If you go back and through our database, you'll see some of the complaints may say that it was not validated or unfounded, but it should at least be investigated. So call 311, please.
All right, Jackie.
All right. So Nathan brought this up earlier, but I wanted to talk to you about the Office of Consumer Protection again. And they work to investigate and resolve consumer complaints, licensing and registering businesses, and engage in consumer education and outreach. But Bill 625 came into effect July of this year because many renters have faced challenges regarding unfair or deceptive trade practices by corporate and private landlords, including unfit rental housing, amenities not as advertised, failure to repair essential building services, imposition of junk fees, predatory towing rules, and chronic housing violations. So the purpose of that bill was to implement stronger protections for renters under the county's consumer protections laws. So if you feel like you have a complaint that you would like the Office of Consumer Protection to look into, again, like Nathan mentioned earlier, you still have to call 311 and go through that process, and then they'll refer you to OCP. You will
Well, they
then
actually they may refer them to Ulta first.
Ulta
So we're
first,
working
okay.
through that process. We have a sort of a workflow where
Okay.
DHCA is the agency that will triage those complaints first. If they're related to landlord tenant or code enforcement, and then we will move them over to Office of Consumer Protection.
That was a strong concern of the Renters Alliance in the beginning when this was extended, because the unintended consequences was possibly creating some confusion from tenants as to where to go. And so we appreciate the no wrong door approach to getting it organized and coordinated, and look forward to seeing it become a fine-tuned machine. Jackie, do you also want to mention ACE?
Sure. The Access to Counsel and Evictions is a program for tenants who I believe are 50% AMI. And you can, if you get a court summons for failure to pay rent, you can call MC 211 and they can connect you with a lawyer. And usually they want to make sure that you have a court summons ahead of time before that. And the Office of the Access to Counsel of Evictions will help you with eviction cases and other rental issues you may have specifically, but it just depends on the specific case itself. And Maryland, Emily just put into the chat the phone number, the 888 direct number for Maryland Legal Aid.
And also CASA is another one of the organizations. Emily's going to put that in the chat too. But this is for people who are facing eviction, who are low income, usually 50% of area median income. And we want to make sure people are taking advantage of that. Do not miss a court date. And if you are facing eviction and going to court, there is access to counsel, getting a lawyer. The landlords will always have their lawyer. Make sure that you've got one, because there might be some way to defend your case, or at least extend your housing so that you can make appropriate arrangements for your own housing stability. Hua, would you say something about voting? Do you think we ought to be doing it these days?
You should vote. It's for your personal interests. So if you want things to change in your life and everyone that you care about, go out and vote when the election comes around. But also just don't focus on like only the federal, but like your county elections, and your state elections as well.
All right. Well, Pat Beckham, who's sitting behind me because their computer's not working at home, would agree with you, right, Pat?
Yes, voting is our power.
That's right. And the Renters Alliance has just reordered thousands of new I'm a Renter and I Vote buttons. And when they come in, we hope that you will start wearing them. In the coming year will be the big elections for county council, county government, state government, and President of the United States. So make sure that we stay active citizens. When we started this over 15 years ago, people said, well, renters, you aren't permanent. You don't pay taxes. You don't really get involved in your community. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we need to demonstrate that that's absolutely not true, that we are active citizens and we care about our communities, and we want to make sure our interests are represented by those we elect.
If you ever wanted to take a look at the power of renters, take a look at the amount of renters that we have in Montgomery County versus the amount of homeowners in Montgomery County, and there is power there.
That's right. Nearly 40% now of residents are renters. Okay, anything else before we say goodnight?
I just want to thank you, Matt, for the invitation to you, to the Renters Alliance team, and especially to all of those who are here, who are participating in this town hall meeting. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I hope I've been helpful, and I'm here if you need me.
Thank you. And we will unfortunately take you up on what you wished for, which is to come back as often as we can get you, to keep updating us on information from Code and from the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Much needed. Unfortunately, we need to repeat that information over and over and over again because it's complicated and it takes a while for people to understand it. And we have new people who also need to hear it for the first time. So with that, I want to say thank you to everybody, particularly to Nathan Bovell, our guest, to all of our staff, and to our treasurer, Josh Fisher, who keeps an eye on our money to make sure we're spending it the right way. Thank you to all. And you can watch this town hall on YouTube, and you can always contact us at info@rentersalliance.org at any time if you want guidance about what steps to take if you have an issue in your rental apartment or community.